The old station wagon crunched to a halt on a gravel patch, its engine sighing in relief. Sunlight, filtered through a colossal canopy of towering pines, dappled the forest floor in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. A breath of air, cool and rich with the scent of damp earth and resin, swept through the open windows, instantly replacing the stale car smell. "We made it," Ben announced, stretching his arms above his head as he stepped out onto the forest floor. Lily and Tom tumbled out after him, their excited chatter mixing with the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. The camping gear would need unpacking, the tent would need setting up, but for now they simply stood and breathed in their first taste of the wilderness that would be their home for the next few days. The air inside the tent had grown thick with the scent of canvas and pine needles, a comforting earthy smell that promised adventure. Ben had zipped them in securely, the sound a definitive closure on the outside world. Lily, tucked into her sleeping bag, wriggled until she was a warm, contented sausage. Tom, next to her, was already a lumpy mound, his eyes wide in the dim glow of Ben's headlamp as their father meticulously arranged their gear against the tent walls. "All right, campers," Ben said, his voice a low rumble. "First night in the wild. Who's excited for tomorrow's hike?" Lily mumbled a sleepy affirmation, her mind already drifting to the prospect of scrambling over rocks and discovering hidden streams. Tom, however, remained still. He was a creature of habit, and the unfamiliar quiet of the woods, punctuated by the chirps of crickets, was a vast departure from the gentle hum of their suburban street. "Dad," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustle of Ben's jacket. "What was that?" Ben paused, his headlamp beam freezing on a half-folded map. "What was what, sport?" "That sound," Tom insisted, his small hand gripping the edge of his sleeping bag. Like someone sighing." Lily, who had been on the verge of drifting off, opened her eyes. She hadn't heard anything beyond the usual nighttime symphony of the forest. Ben chuckled, a warm, reassuring sound. "Just the wind, buddy. The trees talk at night. They whisper their secrets." He clicked off his headlamp, plunging the tent into a velvety darkness. A sliver of moonlight, filtered through the canopy, cast faint, shifting patterns on the ceiling. Silence settled again, deeper, this time. Lily found herself listening, her senses heightened by the sudden absence of light. The crickets seemed to have quieted, or perhaps her ears were simply straining for something else. Then she heard it. It wasn't a sigh, not precisely. More like a breath, drawn in slowly, then released in a soft, drawn-out exhalation. It seemed to swirl just outside the tent, a faint, almost imperceptible current of air that carried with it a whisper. Not words, just a sound like dry leaves skittering across a hard surface, but somehow more intentional. It circled, a slow, deliberate cadence, tracing the perimeter of their nylon sanctuary. Tom let out a small whimper. "There it is again! Did you hear it, Lily?" Lily nodded in the dark, a prickle of unease tracing its way up her spine. It was distinctly different from the usual rustle of leaves or the creak of branches. This was closer, more intimate, as if someone stood just on the other side of the fabric, breathing. Ben shifted, his sleeping bag rustling. "Kids, it's just a breeze. It gets playful at night. Sometimes it finds its way around the tent, trying to sneak in." His tone was light, but Lily could sense a subtle tension in his voice. He was good at pretending, but she knew him. "But it's so quiet everywhere else," Lily said, her voice a low murmur. "And it's going around and around." "That's what wind does, honey," Ben replied, his voice still calm but perhaps a touch too quick. "It eddies and swirls. Creates little pockets of sound. Nothing to worry about. Just close your eyes and imagine the trees singing you a lullaby." He began to hum a quiet, tuneless melody, a familiar lullaby from their childhood. The soft rhythmic sound filled the tent, pushing back the encroaching quiet. Lily tried to focus on his humming, to let it lull her back to sleep. But even through the familiar tune she could still sense it, that faint, breathy circling just beyond the tent wall. It was a phantom presence, a suggestion of something unseen that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. Tom had burrowed deeper into his sleeping bag, his breathing a shallow, rapid puffing. Ben's humming continued, a steady anchor in the dark, until gradually the sound outside faded, or perhaps they finally drifted off into the unsettling dreams of their first night in the wild. Sunlight, filtered through a million dew-kissed leaves, dappled the forest floor. The air, crisp and tasting of pine and damp earth, was a welcome change from the claustrophobia of the tent. Ben, determined to shake off the lingering unease of the night, whistled a cheerful, off-key tune as he led the way. Lily, her initial apprehension replaced by the thrill of exploration, bounced ahead, her bright red wellies splashing through puddles. Tom trudged behind, his face still a little pale, clutching a worn teddy bear. "Look, a ladybug!" Lily squealed, pointing to a tiny red speck crawling up a fern frond. Ben smiled, glad to see her spirits lifted. They'd been walking for perhaps 20 minutes, following a faint game trail that promised a scenic loop back to the campsite, when Lily paused, head cocked. "Dad, did you hear that?" Ben stopped, straining his ears. The wind rustled the high canopy, and a woodpecker drummed a steady rhythm somewhere deep in the woods. "Hear what, sweetheart?" Like a little giggle. She frowned, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Over there." She gestured vaguely towards a denser thicket of alders. Tom, who had finally started to relax, stiffened. "Giggles?" he whispered, his eyes wide. "Like children." "Maybe it's just the wind," Ben said, trying to sound nonchalant. He scanned the trees, but the woods were a labyrinth of shadows and light. "Or a bird. Some birds have really funny calls." They continued on, but the lightness of the morning had subtly shifted. A few minutes later, as they rounded a particularly gnarled oak, a sound undeniably like a suppressed titter floated from the undergrowth. It was light, airy, and unmistakably childlike. Lily gasped. "There it is again! I told you!" Ben's jaw tightened. He peered into the dense foliage, trying to pinpoint the source. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing a little too loudly in the quiet woods. "Anyone there?" Silence answered him, thick and immediate. Tom pressed himself against Ben's leg. "Dad, who is it? Are they hiding?" "Probably just some other campers playing a game," Ben reassured them, though a knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. He didn't see any other tents, nor had he heard any vehicles on the gravel road leading to the site. "Come on, let's keep going. We'll probably bump into them around the next bend." But they didn't. The giggles, always faint, always just out of sight, seemed to dance around them, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right, never allowing them to pinpoint the source. It was like a game of hide-and-seek, where the hiders were invisible. Tom whimpered once, and Ben picked him up, carrying him on his shoulders. Lily, though still curious, had lost some of her earlier exuberance, her eyes constantly darting into the shadows. They eventually reached a small, rocky creek, its water clear and cold. Ben set Tom down, and the boy immediately started picking up smooth stones, his fear momentarily forgotten. Lily, however, was drawn to something half buried in the muddy bank. "Dad, look at this!" she exclaimed, kneeling. She dug around it with a stick, then pulled free a small grey stone, perfectly oval, about the size of her thumb. What made it remarkable was a neat, circular hole bored straight through its center, as if drilled with precision. The edges of the hole were smooth, worn by water. Ben took it from her, turning it over in his palm. "Well, that's unusual. A natural riverstone. But with a perfect hole like that's pretty neat." Lily reached for it. "Can I try something?" Without waiting for an answer, she put the stone to her lips, pressing the hole against them, and blew. A clear, surprisingly loud whistle pierced the quiet of the woods. It was a high, pure note, like a bird's call, yet with an almost ethereal quality to it. The sound hung in the air for a moment, then slowly faded, leaving an even deeper silence in its wake. Tom flinched, startled by the sudden sound. Even Ben felt a prickle on his skin. The woods around them seemed to hold their breath. And then, from somewhere close, much closer than before, a single, distinct giggle floated through the trees. It was followed by another, and then a chorus of soft, airy laughter, like tiny bells chiming in the breeze, receding into the depths of the forest. The second campfire crackled with a comforting rhythm, a counterpoint to the growing twilight chorus of crickets. Ben, expertly coaxing a higher flame from a stray branch, smiled at Lily, who was meticulously arranging a collection of smooth grey stones she'd found near the creek bed. Each one, she declared, held a tiny sleeping gnome. Tom, still clenching his worn teddy bear, sat closer to Ben than the fire, occasionally glancing over his shoulder into the deepening gloom beyond the flickering orange light. He'd spent the afternoon at the creek too, but his finds were less artistic, more about the satisfying plunk they made when dropped into the water. "These are magnificent, Sprout," Ben said, admiring a particularly flat, almost iridescent stone Lily offered him. "You have an eye for treasure," Lily beamed, momentarily forgetting her earlier apprehension. The afternoon had been a joyful blur of discovery, the initial fear of the unknown replaced by the thrill of exploration. Tom, however, hadn't entirely shaken his unease. He'd jumped at a squirrel's sudden scamper, and his eyes kept darting to the tree line, as if expecting something to materialize. Then it started. Not the distant, barely perceptible hum of last night, but clearer, a sibilant shush that wove through the crackle of the fire. It sounded like air escaping a pinhole, then stretched into something more, a playful whisper that seemed to dance just at the edge of hearing, almost a melody. It wasn't one voice, but several, interwoven, light as dandelion fluff, yet undeniably present. Tom's head snapped up, his eyes, wide and glassy, locked onto the darkness. "Did you hear that?" he breathed, his voice barely a squeak. Ben's smile faltered. He'd heard it, distinctly. A low murmur, like a secret shared just out of earshot. He tried to project calm. "Just the wind, buddy. It picks up at night." But the air was still, the leaves on the surrounding trees unmoving. Lily, however, was no longer arranging gnomes. Her head tilted, a curious expression on her face. The whispers seemed to swirl closer, like invisible tendrils reaching for the warmth of the fire. They weren't menacing, not exactly, more like children playing a game, just out of sight. A low, trilling sound, almost like a bird, followed by a soft, sustained sigh. "It's not the wind," Lily stated, her voice quiet but firm. She pushed herself up onto her knees, peering into the deeper shadows. "It sounds like tiny people talking." Ben's hand instinctively went to the small, smooth stone in his pocket, the one Lily had given him, claiming it would keep bad dreams away. "It's probably just echoes, sweetie. The forest plays tricks at night." He tried to keep his voice even, but a prickle of unease snaked up his spine. Last night he'd rationalized it as exhaustion. Tonight, the clarity was undeniable. The whispers intensified, not louder, but more intricate, weaving in and out of each other, a tapestry of hushed sounds. One thread seemed to separate, distinct and almost playful, a sound like fingers tapping lightly on wood, then a soft giggle. It felt as if whatever was out there was circling, testing the boundaries of the firelight. Lily, rather than shrinking back, leaned forward. Her initial apprehension had morphed into a bold curiosity. Her eyes, wide and dark in the firelight, scanned the undulating shadows beyond their small, illuminated haven. The rustling started then. Not a steady breeze, but isolated shivers of leaves, as if something invisible was brushing past them. A single, distinct snap of a twig broke the quiet. "I'm going to look," Lily announced, her voice a determined whisper. Ben started to object, but she was already moving, crawling towards the tent flap. He watched, heart thrumming, as she slowly, cautiously, unzipped the mesh. The whispers seemed to hold their breath, then resumed. A little louder, almost directly outside the tent. Lily pushed the flap aside just enough to peek through the narrow slit. The air outside was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. She held her breath, straining her eyes against the impenetrable blackness beyond the faint glow of the campfire. She saw nothing, only the familiar shapes of the trees, their branches swaying almost imperceptibly in the still air. The shadows, deep and shifting, were just that. Shadows, cast by the fire and the faint light of the emerging stars. A cluster of ferns trembled slightly, but it could have been a passing beetle. A branch dipped, then slowly rose again. A natural movement. The whispering continued, playful and elusive, but there was no source, no discernible form. Just the unseen, dancing around the edges of their world. A dry whisper of leaves impossibly close scraped the tent fabric beside Tom's head. His breath snagged, a small, choked sound. Eyes squeezed shut, he burrowed deeper into his sleeping bag, the synthetic chill against his clammy skin. "They're watching us," he mumbled, muffled by the nylon. "The unseen ones. I feel them." Ben, ever the pragmatist, offered a calm counterpoint. "Nobody's watching, Tom. Just the wind. Or maybe a deer." He glanced at Lily, now perched on her knees, ear pressed to the tent wall. Her earlier apprehension had dissolved, replaced by a keen, almost eager curiosity to pinpoint the source of the unsettling sounds. "It's not the wind," Tom insisted, his voice a high-pitched tremble. He pulled the sleeping bag over his head, forging a dark, suffocating cocoon, his teddy bear clutched so tightly its fur matted. The thick air inside was preferable to the terrifying void beyond his makeshift refuge. Each tiny creak of the tent poles, every distant owl's hoot, sent a fresh jolt of terror through him. Seeing Tom's distress, Dad cleared his throat. All right, everyone settle down. How about a really silly story? About a badger who tried to bake a cake using only acorns and mud." He launched into the tale, his voice deep and comforting, filling the small space. He animated the badger's misadventures with rising and falling inflections, yet even as he spun the yarn, a subtle tension creased the corners of his eyes. His gaze flickered towards the tent flap, then back to his children, a faint furrow between his brows. Lily, however, had long forgotten the badger's culinary woes. She'd shifted from the wall, her attention now snared by a faint, almost imperceptible murmur swirling just beyond the tent. It wasn't a distinct word, more the ghost of conversation, a breathy, unidentifiable cadence. She frowned, head tilted, straining to hear, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was like trying to catch smoke. The story continued, Dad's voice, a steady anchor in the growing quiet, but its usual warmth was subtly missing. He paused mid-sentence, head cocked, listening. The whispering had ceased. For a moment, only crickets chirped, and Tom's heart thudded frantically against his ribs. Then, a new sound emerged, a low, drawn-out sigh, as if the very air outside exhaled. It belonged to neither animal nor wind. It was too deliberate. Dad cleared his throat again, his smile a little too fixed. And so the badger, despite his best efforts, ended up with a very lumpy, very earthy, well, let's just call it a mud pie. He chuckled, a sound lacking its usual ease. He glanced at Ben, a quick, almost imperceptible exchange of worry passing between them. Then his eyes drifted to Lily, now staring intently at a shadowy patch of trees through the tent's mesh window, her small hand reaching out as if to touch something unseen. Tom, still cocooned, let out a small whimper from within his sleeping bag. The silence that followed Dad's story felt heavier, more oppressive than the earlier sounds. It was a listening silence, pregnant with unspoken dread. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Dad, usually a picture of unshakable calm, now fidgeted with his sleeping bag zipper, fingers tracing the cold metal, a telltale sign of his mounting unease. The shadows outside the tent seemed to deepen, coiling and twisting into indistinct shapes. And for the first time, a genuine shiver traced its way down Dad's spine, a chill unrelated to the night air. The final night descended with an unsettling hush, the air thick and still, as if holding its breath. What had been a faint, almost ignorable murmur on previous evenings, now intensified into a palpable presence. It wasn't just a wind anymore, it was a symphony of whispers, 1,000 tiny voices weaving through the fabric of the tent. They weren't distinct words, not yet, but a swirling, sibilant chorus that seemed to press in from all sides, a soft, insistent demand. Tom, predictably, was already a quivering mound of sleeping bag in the corner. His teddy bear Barnaby was clutched so tightly that his synthetic fur looked permanently wrinkled. "They're closer," he whimpered, his voice muffled by the down. "The unseen ones. They're watching." Ben, usually the unshakable pragmatist, shifted uncomfortably on his air mattress. He had dismissed Tom's earlier terrors with a casual shrug, attributing them to an overactive imagination fueled by too many ghost stories. But now even he couldn't deny the overwhelming proximity of the sounds. His eyes, dark in the dim light filtering from the distant moon, met Dad's across the tent. A shared, silent worry passed between them, a recognition that this was beyond the scope of a mere wind trick. Lily, however, felt a different stir. Initially a cold dread had tightened her chest, the sheer volume of the whispers creating a suffocating pressure. But as she listened, truly listened, the fear began to recede, replaced by a profound curiosity. It was like standing on the precipice of a vast, unmapped ocean, the sound of its waves a hypnotic lure. The chorus outside was no longer just an amorphous hum. She could almost pick out individual threads, faint ethereal melodies within the cacophony. Then, through the swirling tapestry of sound, something new emerged. It was a single, distinct thread, impossibly soft yet piercingly clear, cutting through the general murmur. It wasn't a whisper like the others, but a gentle, drawn-out sound, like a sigh carried on a breeze. Lily. Her breath hitched. It was her name, unmistakable, spoken with an intimacy that sent a shiver down her spine, not of cold, but of recognition. "Lily," it came again, a little stronger, weaving through the myriad other faint sounds. It sounded like a child's voice, perhaps, or something ancient and ageless, imbued with a strange, compelling tenderness. Her eyes snapped open wide, searching the shadowy contours of the tent. No one else seemed to have heard it, not with the same clarity. Tom was still burrowed. Ben was staring at the tent wall with a furrowed brow, and Dad was quietly reaching for his flashlight. The collective whispers outside continued their ethereal dance, but for Lily, that one voice resonated, vibrating in her very bones. It wasn't a shout, or a demand, or even a question. It was a call, a delicate beckoning that seemed to reach directly into her, bypassing her ears and settling in her heart. A strange, powerful pull began to assert itself. Every instinct screamed at her to cower, to pull her blanket over her head like Tom. Yet, another, stronger impulse urged her forward, towards the source of that impossible sound. She found herself slowly, almost imperceptibly, pushing her sleeping bag aside. Her bare feet touched the cool ground cloth, a sharp contrast to the warmth of her cocoon. The chorus of tiny voices outside seemed to swell, as if acknowledging her movement, their sibilance growing more intricate, more complex. But above it all, that one distinct murmur persisted, a delicate, almost imperceptible thread in the tapestry of sound. "Lily." It filled her with an unnerving mixture of terror and an almost dizzying sense of wonder. What was out there? What was calling her name in the deep, silent woods? And why her? The unknown beckoned, a siren song sung by an unseen entity, promising something profound and possibly dangerous. She stretched out a hand, not quite touching the tent fabric but reaching, yearning, drawn by the voice that called. The playful banter had evaporated, leaving behind a thick, cloying silence that pressed in from all sides. Ben, usually the unflappable one, shifted inside his sleeping bag, the rustle a jarring counterpoint to the thudding of his own heart. He couldn't deny it any longer. The sounds were too close, too distinct, no longer just a trick of the wind or overactive imaginations. A shared, unspoken worry passed between him and Dad, a glance that spoke volumes without a single word. Lily, who moments ago had been gripped by an icy dread, now felt a peculiar shift within her. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it was being steadily eclipsed by an insistent, almost magnetic curiosity. A voice, distinct from the other whispers, had pierced the night, clear and resonant, calling her name. Not a whisper, not a murmur, but a direct address, pulling at her like an invisible thread. She felt an urge, primal and undeniable, to investigate, to push aside the tent flap, and step into the inky blackness. Tom, meanwhile, had regressed into a quivering, whimpering heap. His sleeping bag had become a cocoon of fear. Barnaby, his faded teddy bear, clutched tightly to his chest. "They're closer, Dad," he choked out, his voice muffled by the downy fabric. "The unseen ones. They're watching us." Dad took a deep, measured breath. The jovial camping trip facade had completely crumbled, replaced by a quiet resolve that etched lines around his mouth. He looked at each of them, a silent promise in his eyes. He wouldn't let them face this alone. With deliberate, almost agonizing slowness, he reached for the tent zipper. The metallic rasp, usually so innocuous, seemed to tear through the fragile piece of the tent, echoing in the confined space. Each tooth of the zipper separating felt like a dramatic pronouncement, a point of no return. The night air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, immediately seeped in, carrying with it a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Dad's hand, steady and unhesitating, reached for the powerful LED flashlight resting beside him. Its beam, when it ignited, cut a brilliant swathe through the oppressive darkness, a stark white spear against the velvet black. He didn't rush. The beam moved with a methodical precision, sweeping from left to right, painting the familiar outlines of trees and bushes in stark relief. The edge of their small clearing, usually a comforting boundary, now felt porous, permeable. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed amplified, imbued with a sinister intent. The powerful beam illuminated the gnarled roots of ancient cedars, the skeletal branches of a fallen birch, the dewy sheen on a spider's web strung between two low-hanging branches. Nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, a prickling sensation on the back of Ben's neck. The beam continued its slow arc, revealing a clump of ferns that swayed almost imperceptibly, as if something had just brushed past them. Dad paused the light there for a long moment, his eyes narrowed, searching for any disturbance, any telltale sign. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets, a sound that now felt unnervingly loud, a mockery of normal. He shifted his weight, rotating slowly on his knees, the beam now sweeping towards the back of the tent, where the thickest undergrowth lay. Shadows danced and stretched, grotesque and elongated, morphing into fleeting phantom shapes. A branch twisted into an almost human-like form, seemed to recoil from the light. Lily felt the pull stronger now, an undeniable urge to crawl out, to follow the voice that still whispered her name, a siren song against the backdrop of the rising tension. Tom whimpered again, clutching Barnaby tighter, his small body trembling uncontrollably. Dad held the light steady, on a particularly dense patch of bushes, his jaw tight. The air shimmered, not from heat but from an unseen presence, a distortion in the natural order of the forest. The beam lingered, unwavering, searching for the source of the unsettling sounds, the voices, the elusive figures that danced just beyond the periphery of sight. He saw nothing tangible, no fur, no eyes, no movement that could definitively be attributed to an animal. But the quiet certainty that something was there, just out of reach, settled over them like a shroud. The brave search was turning up nothing, yet confirming everything. The concentrated beam from Dad's flashlight, a focused spear of illumination, finally stilled. It settled not on the creek's agitated surface, but on a thick stand of hollow reeds along the bank, now swaying with heightened urgency. A stronger gust had risen, whispering through the undergrowth, carrying the deep scent of damp earth mingled with something else, a faint, sweet, decaying perfume. Ben's heart thrummed a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a wild counterpoint to the hush. The familiar chill snaked up his neck, the undeniable sensation of unseen eyes scrutinizing their every move. He swallowed, the effort dry and painful. His mind screamed for escape, for flight, yet his feet were anchored, encased in an invisible lead. He clamped his jaw, attempting to project a composure utterly absent from his churning insides. Lily, however, had undergone a subtle metamorphosis. The tremor in her hands had vanished, replaced by an unnerving stillness. Her wide eyes, once clouded with apprehension, now held a strange magnetic curiosity. It was as if the very air around them vibrated with an unheard frequency, a distinct, insistent voice that seemed to beckon her, a siren song perceptible only to her. She leaned forward, a subtle inclination of her head, as if straining to pluck a whisper from the passing breeze. Tom was beyond such subtle shifts. He was a small, quivering knot of dread, burrowed into Dad's side, his face buried in the well-worn fur of his teddy bear, Mr. Snuggles. His small frame shuddered with silent sobs, punctuated by choked whimpers. "They're watching us, Daddy," he mumbled into the bear's ear, his voice muffled and thick with terror. "They're all watching." As they stood, the wind, now a sustained sigh, swept through the reedy cluster. A low, haunting sound swelled from them, a series of elongated, airy notes that wove and unwove, forming a mournful yet undeniably melodic chorus. This was the whispers, not the ones that had plagued them in the tent, but their raw primal source. Each note lingered, vibrating with a subtle resonance that seemed to seep into Ben's bones, chilling him despite the escalating tension. "See?" Dad's voice, surprisingly calm, almost instructional, cut through the reedy song. "The wind blows through these hollow stems, just like blowing across the top of a bottle. Each one makes a slightly different sound, and together," he gestured, encompassing the swaying reeds, "they make this." The melody intensified, a mournful harmony that seemed to enfold them, drawing them deeper into the forest's embrace. Lily's gaze was transfixed on the reeds, a flicker of something akin to recognition in their depths. It was as if she was listening not merely to the sound but to the narrative it unfolded. Dad then shifted the beam, guiding it slightly downstream to illuminate a small rocky outcropping on the bank. There, nestled among the smooth water-worn stones, were several, with distinct holes bored through them. Some large enough for a thumb, others mere pinpricks. "And these," Dad continued, his voice dropping slightly, "these are where the giggles come from." He reached down, selecting one of the larger holed stones. He held it up, allowing the wind to brush past it. Nothing. Then he blew across one of the holes a sharp, quick puff of air. A short, high-pitched chirrup, undeniably like a stifled giggle, escaped the stone. He repeated the action with a different hole, producing a slightly lower, more resonant sound. The wind catches these holes just right, and it makes that sound. Like the water running over them, or even a tiny creature scurrying past. The forest is full of sounds, Ben, Lily. Most of them have perfectly good explanations, even if they sound a bit spooky in the dark. Lily, without a word, reached out, her small fingers tracing the surface of a particularly smooth dark stone dotted with a cluster of tiny holes. For a moment, the wind seemed to intensify, and a faint, almost imperceptible titter seemed to emanate from the stone as her fingers brushed it. Ben shivered, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He knew Dad was trying to explain, to rationalize, but the sound Lily had perceived, the one calling her name, felt far more ancient, far more knowing than any trick of wind and stone. The forest was indeed full of sounds, and some of them, he suspected, were not so easily dismissed. The rustling returned, not the frantic, skittering kind, but a gentle, rhythmic swish that seemed to encircle their small campsite. Ben, his knuckles white against his knees, pulled Tom closer. Tom, however, was no longer burrowing into his father's side. His head was tilted, eyes wide, fixed on the shadowy periphery of the firelight. Lily, a strange, almost serene smile playing on her lips, mirrored his posture. It's the wind, isn't it?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible above the rising symphony of the forest. He sounded less scared now, more intrigued. Lily nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "And the leaves," she added, her voice a low hum. "And the branches rubbing together." Ben scoffed, a nervous sound. "That's what I've been saying, kids. Just the wind." But his eyes darted uneasily, refusing to settle on any one spot. He wanted to believe it, desperately, but the sheer volume, and the almost conversational quality of the sounds were unsettling. "No, Dad," Lily corrected softly, her gaze still lost in the darkness beyond the fire's reach. "It's more than that. Listen." And they did. The wind indeed threaded its way through the pines, a deep, resonant bass note. But layered over it, almost like an intricate melody, were other sounds. A high-pitched, almost chirping sound that seemed to dance from one tree to another. A deeper, groaning creak that sounded like an ancient hinge, followed by a lighter, almost bell-like chime. It was a complex tapestry of sound, weaving together and separating, creating a continuous, evolving piece of music. Tom's eyes, no longer brimming with tears, tracked the invisible sources of the sounds. "It's like the trees are talking," he breathed, a newfound wonder replacing the terror. Lily hummed in agreement. But not with words. With sounds. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Remember how we heard the whistling? And then the tapping?" Tom's face lit up. "And the rustling circle." Ben, despite himself, found his own fear beginning to recede, replaced by a growing, if still hesitant, curiosity. He had dismissed it all as tricks of the mind, a tired imagination in the dark, but the intricate nature of the soundscape unfolding before them was undeniable. It wasn't random noise, it had a structure, a flow. "It's not just the wind," Lily explained, her voice gaining a quiet confidence. "It's everything. The leaves, the needles, the branches, even the little critters moving through the undergrowth." She pointed vaguely into the shadows. "When the wind pushes through the pine needles just so, it makes that high whistle. And when two branches rub together, one thick and one thin, it makes a different sound, like wood scraping." Tom gasped. "And the crunching? That's the leaves and the squirrels running on them." "Exactly," Lily exclaimed, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. "It's a giant instrument, Dad. The whole forest is making music. We just weren't listening properly before." Ben looked from Lily's radiant face to Tom's awestruck one. The fear had truly vanished from their eyes, replaced by an intense, almost joyful fascination. He still didn't fully grasp it, not like they seemed to, but the overwhelming sense of dread that had gripped him for hours began to dissipate. The unseen watchers, the creeping dread. It had been an illusion, a misinterpretation of a much more natural, albeit incredibly complex phenomenon. The forest hadn't been whispering threats, It had been singing. The rhythmic swish grew more pronounced, a gentle lullaby now, washing over them. The high-pitched chirp softened, becoming more like a distant, comforting murmur. The deeper groans became a steady, grounding beat. It wasn't menacing, it was mesmerizing. Tom yawned, a wide, contented stretch. He leaned his head against Ben's shoulder, no longer seeking refuge, but simply finding comfort in the proximity. Lily, too, settled back, her eyes closing slowly, a serene smile still on her lips. The fire crackled softly, its light dancing on their peaceful faces. As the last embers of the fire glowed, casting long, wavering shadows, the children drifted off. The forest symphony continued, a gentle, living melody that cradled them in its ancient embrace. Ben watched them, the wonder in their expressions mirrored, surprisingly, in his own heart. The whispers at the edge of the firelight weren't the voices of something sinister, but the rich, unending song of nature, a secret language they had finally learned to understand. He closed his eyes, letting the natural music wash over him, a deep sense of peace settling in his bones, a feeling he hadn't known was possible in the heart of the seemingly threatening woods.